Hello and welcome to this special edition of the Newsmakers looking at Syria's questionable future 10 years after the start of its civil war. I'm Andrea Sankey. Over the past decade, the world witnessed peaceful local protests against police brutality and an authoritarian government morph into one of the century's most brutal conflicts. Since 2011, bullets and bombs have terrorized the Syrian people. But the man many blame for that descent into chaos is still largely in control. Bashar al Assad has ruled Syria for over 20 years, and he's made it clear he has no intention of stepping down. While it's hoped the worst of the war is now behind us, the fighting does continue, and Syria desperately needs to forge a path forward. But with Assad still in power, is that even possible? We'll discuss that in just a moment, but first, here's Natalie Pohonen.
How do people endure the unthinkable? And how do they do it for a decade? These aren't hypothetical questions for Syria's people. It's their reality. March 15 marks a decade since the Syrian civil war began. It's estimated that at least 400,000 people were killed in the first 5 years. And about half of Syria's pre-war population has been displaced by fighting. And throughout it all, Syria's Bashar al Assad has clung onto power. In 2012, the Obama administration predicted that the regime's days were numbered. In the early years of the conflict, there were repeated calls from the international community for Assad to step down to pave the way for a political solution and lasting peace. The regime's leader has stayed put with the backing of Russia and Iran. And this year, there are plans for a presidential election.
Assad will hold his own elections to make sure he wins. To convey that Syria is at peace, that reconstruction should begin and sanctions be lifted, and that we should recognize that he won. Nothing else would be a bigger mistake.
Assad and his regime continue to be frozen out by most of the international community. That's been done both politically and financially through the form of sanctions.
And he has done absolutely nothing to regain the legitimacy that he has lost through the brutal treatment of his own people. There is no question of the U.S. normalizing relations with his government anytime soon.
But there are also signs of a diplomatic attitude shift towards Assad, with a potential olive branch coming from the United Arab Emirates.
It is very important for Syria to return to its role in the Arab League.
It's a position that would have been untenable 10 years ago, when the League suspended Syria for the regime's violent crackdown on pro-democracy protesters. But now it's an indication of both how much and how little has changed since 2011.
After a decade of conflict, in the middle of a global pandemic, and faced with a steady stream of new crises, Syria has fallen off the front page. And yet, the situation remains a living nightmare.
Syria is in the grip of an economic crisis, and its effects have been devastating. It's estimated that 80% of the population lives in poverty. The World Food Programme says people are closer to starvation today than ever before. In the last year alone, food prices have doubled.
My sales have really dropped around 50% because of the increase in prices. Sometimes people even buy pieces of a vegetable because they can't afford a whole one.
It's meant caring for the family is that much harder for people like widow and mother of 8, Mohammed.
We haven't had meat since Eid Adha in July last year. And when I go to the market, I can only look at the vegetables because they are so expensive.
If providing the basics of life is this hard for one family, it gives you an idea of just how difficult it will be to rebuild homes, towns, and cities. But all of that seems like a task for the distant future, because any sense of political urgency to find a lasting peace appears long faded. Natalie Pohonen, The Newsmakers.
Now, the situation on the ground remains dire, and that is likely to continue until some structure is created to reach a political solution in Syria. Now, what shape would it take, and who should decide? Joining me now to discuss that and more. Here with me in the studio, Yaser Tabbara, a former spokesperson for the opposition Syrian interim government and now a senior fellow at the Omran Center for Strategic Studies. From Oklahoma City, Joshua Landis, director of the Center for Middle East Studies at Oklahoma University. And in Istanbul, political analyst and author, Onur Erim. Thank you all so much for being with us. Acknowledging the lack of clear solutions going forward, let's talk about options. Yaser, you have talked about decentralization as a way forward. How could that work, bearing in mind especially that most, including the Astana process guarantors, are insisting that Syria maintain its territorial integrity and full sovereignty?
Well, the thing is, both do not have to be mutually exclusive. I mean, you can arrive or achieve a decentralized system while you maintain the territorial and the integrity and the sovereignty of the central state. I think part of the sort of misconception about the idea of decentralization within the context of Syria is always seen through a prism of separatism, especially regarding the Kurdish issue. But as Syrians, we took it upon ourselves as civil society organizations, think tanks, and activists throughout the past many years to look for creative solutions. The fact of the matter is, Syria is defragmented, whether we like it or not. Right now, there are 4 different foreign armies on Syrian soil. There are several zones of influence and control. And so what do you do to stitch the country back together? The way to do that is to look at decentralization as a way forward. One of the ways that you could do that is build upon a lot of the experiences that have taken place over the past 10 years, where areas that got out of the control of the central state and how they managed to govern their own affairs. We have several experiences that range from, in terms of quality and in terms of representation, but we have several models that we can look at and build upon.
Okay, but in your vision, let's just be clear, there is no space for Bashar al Assad.
But that's a separate issue from the question of decentralization. I mean, we see this decentralization as a tool to deconstruct the oppression, to dismantle the tools of oppression that have been accumulated over the past 5 decades through the Ba'ath Party regime and controlled ultimately by the Assad dynasty and by Bashar al Assad right now. Whether pursuing decentralization is something that we need to look at seriously in order for us to bring back the country together, to maintain its territorial integrity. And I don't see a scenario of that happening within a certain measure of success with someone like Bashar al Assad at the helm.
Okay. Let me ask Joshua Landis. I mean, does that sound viable, what Yaser has proposed? Is there, first of all, a future without Bashar al Assad, and is decentralization the answer?
Well, Syria is decentralized. The operative word here is Lebanonization of Syria. Syria has become the battleground for a much larger superpower and regional tug of war. And as we see, Syria has been divided into a Turkish zone, American zone, and a Syrian-Russian zone. And to underline how this works, this tug of war, the Syrian people are, of course, the victims of this decentralization. And we've seen most recently that Lebanonization carried out between a struggle over oil. Israel has destroyed about 10 Iranian ships bringing oil that's desperately needed to Syria for electricity, heating, and so forth. In response, Russia and Syria attacked an oil market just north of Aleppo in the Turkish zone. They couldn't attack the Americans because they're too strong, but the Turks are the weak link here. So they attacked the oil market, blowing up about 150 oil trucks. This tit-for-tat war, this decentralization, if you will, and struggle over who's going to rule Syria in the future is causing the immiseration of the Syrian people, as you pointed out in your intro. And that's the terrible reality. You know, decentralization has become, in a sense, a catchword to legitimize the fragmentation of Syria in order to try to get rid of Assad. And I think the Americans believe that by squeezing the economy, Syria will collapse internally and Assad will go. I don't think this is realistic in any way because there is no more opposition in Syria. The little opposition that's left is quarantined in Idlib and is controlled by Turkey and northern Aleppo. But there is nobody who's going to walk into Damascus and overthrow Assad. And countries don't just crumble. They have to be overthrown, somebody like Assad. So I don't see Assad going. I see this tug of war persisting, and the Syrian people will be the victims, and Syria will be Lebanonized, as Lebanon was the proxy, the battleground, weak state, battleground for foreign powers for a long time to come.
Okay. Yaser, go ahead.
But I think that's exactly the type of superficial approach to this whole idea of decentralization. I mean, we're not talking about decentralization in the sense of having 3 or 4 different regions that are separate from each other. We're talking about a homegrown solution to actually bring back the country together, to actually give legitimacy to a central government in Damascus that is able to govern the affairs of the country, where it actually controls the natural resources of the entire country. There are several issues that I have with what Joshua has said in terms of describing the situation on the ground. I think it's much more complex than that, Josh. I think that the Northeast is an entire issue to be dealt with. I think that there are a lot of issues in the South that are taking place right now in terms of understandings of ceasefire agreements that are being just completely undermined. I think control is, Assad is continuously losing sovereignty and losing control, and I think the only way to deal with those issues is to look at the question of decentralization from a very bottom-up approach. Look at, what are the files that local communities can actually govern, and built upon
Right.
these on a political level, on an economic level, on basic files like education and community policing, and then build that up to a point where you can actually have a central state that deals in a healthy way with decentralized entities.
Okay, Joshua, I saw for a second you did see some value in what Yaser was saying. You can respond to that quickly, and then I have another angle I want to ask you about. Go ahead.
Well, it would be lovely if Syria were a democracy and federalized and everything else. I just don't see it happening because everybody is warring over who's going to control Damascus, and that's really the prize here. I wish, the whole Middle East could have this kind of federalism, and there would be a Palestinian federalism and Israeli federalism, and the Christians and Shia in Lebanon and so forth would be wonderful. But we've seen that this hasn't happened over years of struggle. And, it's like the Kurdish question in Turkey. Unfortunately, we haven't moved to this kind of democratic power sharing model. And it's been one that the West has talked about in the Middle East for decades. But it hasn't come to be.
Okay, Joshua, though, but since you are comparing Syria to Lebanon in some senses, wasn't there that kind of sectarian power sharing agreement reached? And notwithstanding the troubles we're seeing in Lebanon today, for many years after the peace agreement, Lebanon was a peaceful and prosperous country under sectarian power sharing. Could that not work then, if your Lebanization metaphor is correct, in the case of Syria?
Well, your proposal is exactly what many people proposed for Iraq. When America walked in there and overthrew Saddam Hussein in 2003, everybody was saying the Lebanon model will work. And that's what America tried to produce in Iraq, is a power sharing between Kurds, Shia, and so forth. And it hasn't worked well, and it hasn't worked well in Lebanon either, which totally
but the decentralization model in Syria will not be built upon sectarian lines. The reality of the situation in Syria is that you have an overwhelming majority of a certain population, unlike Lebanon, unlike Iraq, there's a clear majority, even within the different areas that the different de facto zones of control, these areas still have clear majorities of a particular population. Even the areas that are controlled by the Kurds, for example, or by the SDF, I should say. The majority of that area are Arabs. The same thing in the areas that are controlled by the regime. In terms of the religious and ethnic background. So I think that is, we really cannot invoke the scenario of Lebanon, the scenario of Iraq every time we want to talk about moving forward in Syria. I think that is just going to bring us a few steps back, and it's just not going to get us anywhere.
Okay, Joshua, I know you do believe there are certain parallels here, but let me first bring Onur into the discussion. Onur, I have to look at actually what President Erdogan said today. He published a piece saying that the surest path to peace and stability in Syria runs through Ankara. How so?
Well, first of all, let's get to the situation. Both your guests are talking about overwhelming majority. I'd like to point out that near overwhelming majority of the Syrian, citizens actually live in Turkey, as they have been for the last 10 years. So that's number one. Number two, we could go back to historical roots and the historical problems that Syria and both Syria and Iraq and the region has had, since Ottomans and ever since the colonial involvement in this area, much before World War I. But that would be, just going over historical facts and figures, just one extra time. So I won't. But the point is, Turkey, as not as any other country in the world, has trying to involve herself into this very peacefully to make sure that Syria keeps her territorial integrity, centralized government, and prosperity for its people. No one else has these concerns. Not the U.S., who's 9,000 miles away. Not Russia, who's 4,000 miles away. And whether Assad really thinks about the future and the present well-being of his citizens, I don't know, but Turkey has been here for thousands of years, the state, and it will be here thousands of years. It will pass the time of Assad. It will pass the time of President Erdogan. So our main concern is to make sure that the people of our neighbor is in prosperity, in wealth, and hopefully a group of people that will be living there without the fear of their life. As I said, everybody undermines, everybody looks the other way when we say there's millions of Syrians have been living in Turkey, that has taken refuge in Turkey for the past 10 years. And Turkey is not only taking care of them, she's also trying to educate in their own language as well as Turkish, and has been offering healthcare for these people, all the social things that it could provide, or it does provide to its her own citizens. Everybody has been overlooking these facts. We are not like Russians. We are not like the Americans. We have been here. We will be here. And the well-being of the Syrian citizens is far more important for Turkey than any other nation in the world.
Joshua, let me ask you to pick up on that. Do you think the United States in particular has not given Turkey kind of the credit and weight due in respect to this conflict? Perhaps only seeing Turkey as, a host for refugees. They say, thank you very much, great job, but not giving Turkey the weight and influence it might deserve in the political process here.
Well, I think at first it did. President Obama was very interested in getting Turkey to lead, and America would follow, and really pushed Erdogan to drop his friendship with Assad and push for some kind of exit for Assad, in which Turkey did. But then things went wrong, and most of the military arms were sent through Turkey. The militias were trained in Turkey, but then ISIS and Al-Qaeda grew too big, and America got spooked, and America eventually turned against Turkey's leadership, thinking that it would turn to some sort of radical solution. And this is what's caused the America to switch to the Kurds and the deterioration of U.S. relations with Turkey.
So was that before or after? Was that before or after the U.S. sent over, I think, 30,000 containers of weapons, light to heavy machinery, to military machines and guns and ammunition to PKK in Syria? I'm sorry, YPG. That's what they're called there. Was that before or after the U.S. decided to send all these weapons, all this ammunition to a terrorist organization?
The U.S. strategy at first was to help Turkey arm Sunni Arab rebels, and that switched. But the point is that the United States doesn't have real faith in Turkey solving this problem. And Turkey may be the solution for Idlib in northern Aleppo, which could become like Hatay, which was Iskenderun. The French tried a federal organization of Syria, but they gave away a big hunk of Syria to Turkey in 1938, and they've become Turks because many would prefer to live under Turkey than to live under Assad. And that's a very possible scenario, that those regions would continue to be Turkish and would evolve like the Hatay, and the people would accept Turkish nationality. That's quite possible. Turkey,
you're talking about people that have lived under Ottoman citizenship for, I guess, 700-800 years.
Exactly.
You're talking as if these guys came from Mars. These guys were citizens of the Ottoman Turkish Empire.
It is very interesting that this discussion is actually taking place with the big assumption that Syrians have little to zero agency in what how events transpire. And unfortunately, a lot of that is true. But we really need to go back to the basics. I mean, what I am proposing, what I was saying at the very beginning, is not an international solution that basically parachutes on Syria and on the political process and imposes a form of decentralization. What I was talking about is a reality that seems to be frozen, that seems to continue to be frozen for as long as the U.S. and Russia are just not on the same page when it comes to Syria. And it doesn't seem like they're going to be on the same page for a very long time to come. What do we do with this reality? That's the question that I think the right question to be asked. And what I'm proposing is that there is a de facto homegrown solution that needs to be looked upon. Syrians in the northeast have to start compromising and start talking to Syrians in the northwest. And Syrians in the northwest, they have to start talking to Syrians in Daraa and build upon these experiences. I'm hoping, as a Syrian, not as an analyst, but as a Syrian, as someone who continually visits the Northwest and sees how this nascent economy is developing little by little, right, for that to actually be built upon and to have some meat on its bones and become a sort of a governance system that becomes more or less self-sustaining. So when the time comes and there is a potential for solution, we take into consideration the local agency of people in these areas.
Right. We heard Joshua asking again, though, the right now unanswerable question is, how do we get rid of Assad if this is your scenario in practice? And Onur, we also have the issue as well of, if the U.S. continues under the Biden administration to continue arming and supporting a militia group on the Turkish border that fuels the conflict in many ways between these Turkish ideals in the area and actual fighting, how can we work that out with America still in the equation, arming the groups that Turkey sees as terrorist enemies? Onur, quickly, final words?
Sure. I think, finally, if we do not find some kind of a way to make sure that there's just many less, hands in the pocket when it comes to Syria. First of all, I don't think we're going to succeed on anything. And secondly, whatever is done, whatever we try to do or anybody else tries to do, unless we involve the people of Syria into the process as much as possible, as near to 100% as possible, nothing is going to succeed. I think there's just too many hands in the pocket when it comes to international involvement, and that I think a lot of people sometimes undermine the fact that the Syrian people must be involved in the entire process as much as possible.
Okay, Onur, I will have to give you the last word. Very unfortunately, we're out of time for this panel, but I'd like to thank all three of you so much for joining us on The Newsmakers, and thanks to our viewers for tuning in as well. See you next time.